The morning sun cast long shadows across the palace gardens as Catherine stood at the tall windows of the morning room, her fingers tracing patterns on the cool glass. The news had come 3 days ago, delivered in the formal language that royal announcements always carried, but the weight of it still felt surreal. After 15 years of dedicated service to the crown, she and William would be stepping back from their royal duties to pursue humanitarian work abroad. The decision hadn't been easy. Catherine remembered the late-night conversations, the careful consideration of their children's futures, and the countless discussions with advisors who had become more like family over the years. The Kingdom of Astoria had been their life, their purpose, their everything. But sometimes, she reflected, the greatest service one could give was knowing when to pass the torch to others who could carry it forward. William entered the room quietly, his footsteps familiar on the polished marble floor. Even after 20 years of marriage, he still moved with the quiet confidence that had first caught her attention at university. His dark hair showed threads of silver now, earned through years of public service and the weight of responsibility that came with being second in line to the throne. "The children are asking questions again," he said softly, settling into the chair beside her. Their 3 children had handled the news with typical royal composure in public, but privately, they were struggling to understand why their parents would choose to leave behind everything they had known. Catherine turned from the window, her blue dress catching the morning light. "Princess Elena called this morning. She wanted to discuss the transition timeline." Elena, William's younger sister, would be taking over many of their charitable patronages. It was a natural progression that had been planned for years, but the reality of it felt overwhelming. The couple had spent the weekend at their country estate, away from the constant attention of the media and the well-meaning but exhausting parade of palace officials who needed to discuss logistics. There, surrounded by the gardens Catherine had personally designed and the stables where William had taught their children to ride, they had found moments of peace to process their decision. "Do you remember our first official engagement together?" William asked, reaching for her hand. "That children's hospital in the northern provinces. You were so nervous you barely spoke for the first hour." Catherine smiled at the memory. "I was terrified I would say something wrong or trip over my dress or somehow embarrass the crown. You kept whispering jokes to make me laugh." That had been the beginning of their partnership, not just as husband and wife, but as a team dedicated to serving their people. The years that followed had been a whirlwind of state dinners, charity galas, international visits, and countless ribbon-cutting ceremonies. They had weathered scandals, celebrated victories, and slowly earned the respect and affection of the Astorian people. Their work with veterans, mental health awareness, and children's education had become the cornerstone of the modern monarchy's relevance. But lately, both had felt the pull towards something different. The humanitarian crisis in the distant nation of Valeria had captured their attention months ago, and when the opportunity arose to lead a major international relief effort there, it felt like a calling they couldn't ignore. It would mean leaving behind the formal structures of royal life, but it also meant the chance to make a direct, hands-on difference in ways that ceremonial duties simply couldn't provide. The palace staff had been informed in small groups, sworn to secrecy until the official announcement. Catherine would never forget the look in Mrs. Henderson's eyes, the head housekeeper who had become like a second mother to her. The woman had served the royal family for 40 years and had never seen a senior royal voluntarily step away from duty. "Your Highness," Mrs. Henderson had said, her voice thick with emotion, "are you certain this is what you want? The people love you both so dearly." And that was perhaps the hardest part of all. The polls consistently showed that Catherine and William were the most popular members of the royal family, after the king himself. Their departure would leave a void that would be difficult to fill, and they both understood the weight of that responsibility. But as Catherine looked out at the gardens where she had hosted countless garden parties and state receptions, she felt a sense of peace about their decision. They had given their all to the crown and to Astoria. Now it was time to give their all to a different kind of service, one that would take them far from the comfort of palace walls but closer to the kind of direct human connection that had always motivated their work. William squeezed her hand gently. "Second thoughts?" he asked, though his voice carried no judgment, only understanding. Catherine shook her head. "No second thoughts, but I want to make sure we do this right. Our farewell to the people, to the staff, to this life we've built. It needs to honor what we've shared together while opening the door to what comes next. Outside, the palace guards were changing shift, their red uniforms bright against the gray stone of the courtyard. In a few hours, the press would gather for their weekly briefing, and rumors would continue to swirl about the royal couple's future plans. But for now, in the quiet of the morning room with the sun warming their faces, Catherine and William simply held each other's hands and prepared for the most important transition of their lives. The grand ballroom had never looked more magnificent than it did that evening, transformed into a farewell celebration that would be remembered for generations. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light across the assembled guests, a carefully curated mixture of dignitaries, charity leaders, and longtime supporters who had shared the royal couple's journey over the past 15 years. Catherine moved through the crowd with practiced grace, her emerald gown trailing behind her as she stopped to speak with each group. The evening had been planned as their formal goodbye to the charitable organizations they had championed, but it felt more like a family reunion. These were the people who had stood beside them through countless campaigns, who had helped them turn royal patronage into real, measurable change in people's lives. Sir James Morrison, the elderly chairman of the Veterans Support Foundation, clasped William's hand warmly. "Your Royal Highness, I must tell you, when you first came to us 12 years ago, we were just a small organization struggling to help a few hundred veterans. Look at us now. We've helped over 50,000 families rebuild their lives." William's eyes reflected the pride and emotion he felt. "Sir James, you know as well as I do that the success belongs to your team and the communities that embraced these families. Catherine and I were simply fortunate to be part of something so much larger than ourselves." Across the room, Catherine was deep in conversation with Dr. Sarah Chen, the brilliant psychiatrist who had helped them develop the groundbreaking mental health initiative for young people. "Your Highness, I hope you know that the protocols we developed here in Astoria are now being implemented in 17 countries. The ripple effect of your work will continue long after tonight." The evening's program included presentations from each of their major charitable partners, but what moved both William and Catherine most were the personal stories. Maria Santos, a single mother who had received support through their housing initiative, spoke with quiet dignity about how the program had not only provided her family with a home, but had given her the stability she needed to complete nursing school. "Your Royal Highnesses," Maria said, her voice carrying clearly through the ballroom's excellent acoustics, "you didn't just help me find a house. You helped me believe that my dreams were possible. My daughter is now studying medicine because she saw that her mother could change her life with the right support." As the formal presentations concluded, the evening shifted into a more relaxed celebration. William found himself at the piano, playing the gentle melodies he had learned as a child while guests gathered around. It was exactly the kind of informal moment that had always defined their approach to royal duties. Accessible, genuine, and focused on human connection rather than ceremony, Catherine joined her husband at the piano bench, and together they led the room in singing traditional Astorian folk songs. The sight of the royal couple, surrounded by everyone from government ministers to grassroots volunteers, all singing together with such obvious affection, captured perfectly what their tenure had represented. Later, as the evening began to wind down, Princess Elena approached the couple. William's sister had always been more comfortable behind the scenes than in the spotlight, but she had agreed to take on several of their most important patronages. Her nervous excitement was evident as she spoke with the departing charity leaders, asking detailed questions about ongoing projects and upcoming initiatives. "She'll do wonderfully," Catherine murmured to William as they watched Elena deep in conversation with the children's education advocates. "She has such a natural empathy for this work." "I know she will," William replied, "but I also know she's terrified of disappointing everyone. We should make sure she knows she has our full support as she finds her own way with these organizations." The most touching moment of the evening came near the end, when the staff from their private office presented them with a leather-bound album, filled with photographs and letters from the thousands of people whose lives had been touched by their work. Page after page showed faces from around Astoria and beyond. Children who had benefited from educational programs, veterans who had found new purpose, families who had been brought together through various initiatives. Mrs. Peterson, their longtime private secretary, had tears in her eyes as she presented the album. "Your Royal Highnesses, We wanted you to have something that would remind you of the love and gratitude that follows you wherever you go. These are just a few of the many lives you've changed. As guests began to depart, each stopping for personal goodbyes, Catherine and William remained in the ballroom long after the last dignitary had left. The staff worked quietly around them, clearing glasses and folding chairs, but no one rushed the couple as they stood together looking out at the gardens through the tall French doors. "It feels like the end of a chapter," Catherine said softly. "The end of one chapter," William corrected gently, "but the beginning of another. Tonight reminded me why we fell in love with this work in the first place. It was never about the titles or the ceremonies. It was about the connections, the relationships, the chance to be part of something meaningful." As they finally made their way upstairs to their private apartments, both carried with them the warmth of the evening and the certainty that they were making the right choice. The formal farewell to their charitable work had been everything they had hoped it would be, a celebration of shared accomplishments and a launching pad for the future endeavors of everyone in the room. Tomorrow would bring more meetings, more logistics to arrange, and more questions from the press, but tonight had been about gratitude, love, and the kind of human connection that would continue to guide them wherever their path might lead. The letters had been arriving for weeks, but today the palace mailroom reported they were receiving over 3,000 messages daily from citizens across Astoria and beyond. Catherine sat in her private study, reading through a carefully selected sample that her staff had organized by theme and region. Each envelope contained a piece of someone's heart, and she felt the weight of responsibility to honor every single sentiment expressed. "My dear Princess Catherine," wrote Mrs. Eleanor Whitfield from the coastal town of Marlborough. 40 years ago you visited our school when our son Timothy was struggling with his reading. You sat with him for 20 minutes and convinced him that being different was a gift, not a burden. Today he's Dr. Timothy Whitfield, and he credits that conversation with changing his life's direction. William found her there hours later, surrounded by neat stacks of correspondence organized by topic. The afternoon sun streamed through the tall windows, illuminating the tears on her cheeks as she read story after story of lives touched by their work. "This is impossible," she said softly, gesturing to the letters. "How do we respond to this kind of trust and love? How do we say goodbye to relationships that have meant everything to us?" William settled into the chair across from her desk, picking up one of the letters from the veteran's pile. The handwriting was shaky, clearly written by someone whose hands had been affected by age or injury, but every word pulsed with gratitude and affection. The decision had been made to spend their final month conducting a farewell tour of Astoria, visiting the communities and organizations that had been central to their work. It would be physically exhausting and emotionally overwhelming, but both felt it was the only way to properly honor the relationships they had built. Their first stop was the Northern Highlands, where their early work with rural education initiatives had begun. The small village of Glenmore had transformed dramatically since their first visit 15 years earlier. What had once been a struggling community with a failing school was now a thriving hub of innovation, with students regularly winning national academic competitions and young families choosing to stay rather than migrate to the cities. The welcome they received was beyond anything they had experienced before. The entire village had turned out, along with families who had driven from neighboring towns. Children held hand-painted banners reading, "Thank you for believing in us," and "Our heroes forever." The local brass band played traditional melodies as the royal motorcade arrived. Margaret Thompson, now the headmistress of Glenmore Primary School, had been a young teacher when Catherine and William first visited. She stood before the assembled crowd, her voice strong despite the emotion that threatened to overwhelm her. "Your Royal Highnesses, when you first came to Glenmore, our school had 63 students and we were facing closure. Today we have 215 students, a waiting list for enrollment, and a reputation as one of the finest rural schools in the kingdom. But more than that, you showed us that our dreams for our children were not too big, and our community was not too small to matter." The couple spent the entire day in Glenmore, visiting classrooms where they recognized now teenage faces they had met as small children, touring the new science laboratories that their foundation had helped fund, and sharing lunch with families who had become friends over the years of partnership. In the afternoon, they walked through the village with Mayor Patrick Burns, who proudly showed them the new community center, the expanded library, and the small business incubator that had brought jobs and hope to the region. At each stop, people approached them not with formal deference but with the warmth of genuine affection. "You know," Mayor Burns said as they paused by the war memorial that William had helped restore, "when word came that you were leaving royal duties, there wasn't a dry eye in the village council meeting. But then we started talking about what your example had taught us, and we realized the greatest tribute we could give you was to continue growing and thriving." The most emotional moment came during the evening community gathering in the village hall. Local families shared stories of how the various programs initiated by the royal couple had affected their lives. Young farmers talked about agricultural innovation grants that had saved family farms. Parents spoke about educational opportunities that had opened doors for their children. Elderly residents described healthcare improvements that had allowed them to remain in the community they loved. But it was 8-year-old Lucy Morrison who captured everyone's hearts when she approached the microphone with a carefully prepared speech written in her best handwriting. "Your Royal Highnesses," she began, her voice small but clear, "my grandmother says you're like guardian angels who helped our village remember how special it is. She says angels have to move on to help other people sometimes, but they leave magic behind. So thank you for leaving magic in Glenmore." As Catherine and William prepared to leave that evening, the entire village lined the main street, holding candles that flickered like stars in the gathering darkness. Children threw flower petals while adults simply stood in respectful silence, many with tears streaming down their faces. On the drive back to the palace, both were quiet for a long time, processing the overwhelming response they had received. Finally, Catherine spoke. "I understand now why this is so hard for everyone. We didn't just do charitable work together. We built relationships. We became part of their stories, and they became part of ours. Leaving isn't just a professional transition. It's saying goodbye to family." William nodded, watching the countryside pass by the window. "But did you see the pride in their eyes when they talked about what they've accomplished? The programs we started together will continue because they own them now. They don't need us anymore. They needed us to help them discover what they were capable of, and they've done that." As the palace lights came into view, both felt a renewed sense of purpose about their farewell tour. Each community they visited would be a chance to celebrate shared accomplishments and to reinforce the foundation they had built together. A foundation strong enough to support continued growth long after their departure. The private dining room had never hosted such an emotionally charged dinner. Catherine and William sat with their 3 children around the familiar mahogany table, where they had shared thousands of family meals. But tonight's conversation would shape their family's future in ways that none of them could fully anticipate. Prince Alexander, now 17 and preparing for university, had been the most vocal about his concerns regarding his parents' decision. As the eldest, he understood better than his siblings the constitutional implications of their choice and the scrutiny it would bring to the entire family. "I still don't understand why you have to leave everything behind," Alexander said, his voice carrying the frustration that had been building for weeks. "Why can't you do humanitarian work while still being part of the royal family? Why does it have to be one or the other?" Catherine reached across the table to touch her son's hand. "Darling, sometimes the most honest service requires complete commitment. The work we're being called to do in Valyria will require us to live there, to understand the culture deeply, to be present in ways that royal duties would make impossible." Princess Charlotte, 15 and remarkably perceptive, had been quieter than usual throughout the family discussions. Tonight she surprised everyone with the maturity of her question. "Mom, Dad, are you doing this because you're not happy being royal? Because if that's true, I need to know. I need to understand what that means for my future." William set down his fork and looked directly at his daughter. "Charlotte, we've never been happier than we've been serving Astoria and its people. But happiness isn't the only consideration when making life choices. Sometimes you have to ask yourself where you can do the most good, where your particular talents and experiences are most needed." The youngest, Prince Louis, who had just turned 12, had been struggling the most with the practical implications of his parents' decision. Will we still live in the palace? Will I still go to the same school? Will people still want to be friends with me if you're not royal anymore? Catherine felt her heart break a little at the innocence of his concerns. The children had grown up with privilege, but they had also grown up with the constant awareness that their lives were different from those of their peers. The security details, the protocol requirements, the public scrutiny, all of it would change but not disappear entirely. "Louis, we'll always be your parents first and foremost," Catherine said gently. "The titles might change, but our family doesn't change, and the friends who care about you as a person will still want to be your friends no matter what titles we carry." The family had spent considerable time with counselors and advisors, preparing for this transition. The children would remain in Astoria, continuing their education while their parents established the humanitarian foundation in Valeria. It was a compromise that satisfied no one completely, but seemed to serve everyone's needs reasonably well. Alexander suddenly straightened in his chair, his expression shifting from frustration to something that looked like understanding. "You're doing this for us too, aren't you? You're showing us that service doesn't have to look like what everyone expects it to look like." William smiled at his eldest son's insight. "One day, each of you will have to decide what kind of life you want to lead and what kind of service you want to give to the world. We want you to know that there are many ways to make a difference, and sometimes the most important thing you can do is follow your conscience, even when it's difficult." The conversation continued late into the evening, with the children asking practical questions about holidays, communication, and family traditions. Catherine and William answered each question honestly, acknowledging that they didn't have all the solutions but expressing confidence that their family bond was strong enough to weather this transition. The next morning brought a different kind of challenge. The weekly audience with King Frederick, William's father, had always been a formal affair, but today's meeting carried special significance. The king had been supportive of their decision in principle, but the practical implications for the monarchy were complex and far-reaching. "William, Catherine," the king began, his voice carrying both affection and concern, "I want you to understand that I respect your choice and I'm proud of the service you've given to our people. But I also need you to understand the position this creates for the crown." The king's study was lined with portraits of previous monarchs, each of whom had faced their own challenges in balancing personal desires with royal duty. Catherine found herself looking at Queen Isabella III, who had abdicated 3 centuries earlier to enter a convent, causing a constitutional crisis that had taken decades to resolve. "Your Majesty," Catherine said respectfully, "we've spent months considering the constitutional implications. We believe that stepping back now, while the monarchy is strong and popular, actually serves the crown's long-term interests better than continuing in roles where we might not be able to give our full attention." The king nodded slowly. He had seen the polling data and the constitutional lawyers' reports. Public support for the monarchy remained high, and Princess Elena had been preparing for increased responsibilities for years. The transition could be managed smoothly if handled correctly. "What concerns me," the king continued, "is not the immediate impact, but the precedent this sets. If senior royals can simply choose to walk away from their duties, what does that mean for the concept of hereditary service?" William had anticipated this question. "Father, with respect, I don't think we're walking away from service. We're expanding our definition of it. The monarchy has always evolved to remain relevant to the times. Perhaps this is part of that evolution." The conversation lasted over 2 hours, covering everything from the formal announcement process to the long-term implications for the succession. By the end, the king seemed genuinely at peace with their decision, though he still harbored concerns about public reaction. "Very well," King Frederick said finally, "but I want your word that this farewell will be conducted with the dignity and grace that our people deserve. If you're going to leave them with something beautiful to remember." As Catherine and William left the king's study, both felt a weight lift from their shoulders. The hardest conversations were behind them now. Their children understood and supported their choice even if they still had concerns. The king had given his blessing. All that remained was to craft a farewell that would honor their past while opening the door to their future. That afternoon, they met with their communications team to begin planning their final public appearance as senior royals. It would need to be something unprecedented, something that captured the unique relationship they had built with the Astorian people over 15 years of dedicated service. The National Cathedral had witnessed many historic moments in Astoria's 1,000-year history, but nothing quite like the ceremony that was taking place on this crisp autumn morning. What had begun as a simple farewell service had, evolved into something extraordinary, a celebration of service that brought together every segment of Astorian society in a way that hadn't been seen since the king's coronation 20 years earlier. Catherine stood in the vestry, adjusting her midnight blue dress one final time. She had chosen the color deliberately. It was the same shade she had worn to her first official royal engagement 15 years ago. The dress was elegant but not ostentatious, formal but approachable, perfectly embodying the balance she and William had tried to strike throughout their royal tenure. Through the ancient stone walls, she could hear the sounds of the gathering crowd. The cathedral could seat 2,000 people, and every seat was occupied. But what made this service unique was not just the size of the congregation, but its composition. Seated alongside cabinet ministers and foreign ambassadors were the people Catherine and William had met during their years of service: the veterans, the school children now grown up, the families who had benefited from their various initiatives. William joined her in the vestry, resplendent in his naval uniform adorned with the medals and honors he had earned through his military and royal service. Despite the formal attire, his expression was relaxed, even peaceful. The past month of farewell visits had been emotionally exhausting, but they had also reinforced his confidence that they were making the right choice. "Are you ready for this?" he asked, straightening his ceremonial sword one last time. Catherine smiled, thinking of all the times he had asked her that question over the years. Before state dinners, before difficult speeches, before moments that had tested their resolve and their partnership. "I've never been more ready for anything in my life," she replied. The processional began with the ancient hymn that had opened royal ceremonies for centuries, but the service itself was a blend of tradition and innovation that reflected their approach to modern monarchy. Archbishop Michael Thornton, who had married them 20 years earlier, led the ceremony with words that acknowledged both the weight of their decision and the hope it represented. "We gather today not to mourn an ending," the Archbishop began, his voice carrying clearly through the cathedral's perfect acoustics, "but to celebrate a transformation. His and Her Royal Highnesses have shown us that service takes many forms, and that the greatest service sometimes requires the courage to change course when the need arises." The service included readings from diverse religious traditions, reflecting the multicultural nature of modern Astoria. A young Muslim woman whose family had been helped by their refugee integration program read from the Quran. A Buddhist monk who had worked with them on mindfulness initiatives. For military veterans, offered a meditation on compassion. A Jewish rabbi whose synagogue had been restored through their interfaith cooperation efforts spoke about the importance of community. But it was the musical portions of the service that truly captured the emotional significance of the moment. The National Boys Choir, many of whose members had met Catherine and William through their youth development programs, performed pieces from around the world, songs that reflected the global scope of the humanitarian work that would define the couple's next chapter. When it came time for the farewell addresses, William spoke first. His speech was brief but powerful, focusing on gratitude rather than accomplishment, on shared achievements rather than personal sacrifice. 15 years ago, Catherine and I were given the extraordinary privilege of serving as your representatives around the world, and as advocates for causes that matter to all of us. What we discovered was that the real privilege was not in the titles we carried, but in the relationships we built and the trust you placed in us." He paused, looking out over the congregation, making eye contact with faces he recognized from years of public service. "Today we're not saying goodbye to service. We're saying hello to a new kind of service, one that will take us far from these familiar surroundings, but will always carry with it the values and the love that we've shared with you here in Astoria." Catherine's address was more personal, reflecting on the journey that had brought them to this moment and the lessons they had learned along the way. "When I first married into this family, I thought my role would be to support the institution of monarchy. What I learned was that the institution is only as strong as the relationships that sustain it, and those relationships are built one conversation, one shared moment, one act of service at a time." She spoke about the letters they had received, the lives they had been privileged to touch, and the hope that their example might inspire others to find their own ways of making a difference in the world. "We leave knowing that the work we started together will continue in capable hands, and we go forward knowing that the love we've shared will always connect us." no matter how many miles might separate us. The most moving moment of the service came when representatives from each of their major charitable partnerships came forward to light candles, creating a constellation of light that filled the cathedral's ancient nave. Each flame represented not just an organization or a cause, but the countless individual lives that had been touched by their work. As the ceremony concluded, the congregation rose as one to sing the national anthem, but the words carried new meaning in this context. The anthem spoke of land and liberty, of heritage and hope, but today it felt like a blessing for the journey ahead, rather than a farewell to the past. Outside the cathedral, thousands more people had gathered, lining the streets for miles in every direction. The route back to the palace became an impromptu parade of gratitude, with people of all ages holding signs, throwing flowers, and simply standing in respectful appreciation for 15 years of dedicated service. As their carriage made its way slowly through the crowds, both Catherine and William were struck by the faces they saw, not just the faces of strangers showing support, but the faces of people they recognized, people whose lives had intersected with theirs through various charitable works and royal engagements over the years. "Look," Catherine said softly, pointing to a group of teenagers holding a banner reading "Glenmore School thanks you forever." They were some of the students from their very first educational initiative, now young adults preparing for university and careers. Near the palace gates, they spotted Maria Santos, the single mother who had spoken so eloquently at their charity farewell dinner. She stood with her daughter, now a medical student, both of them crying and waving with unrestrained joy. As the palace came into view, William reached for Catherine's hand. "Whatever happens next," he said, "we did this right. We honored what we were given, and we're leaving it stronger than we found it." The formal ceremony was over, but the day was far from finished. That evening would bring their final official appearance as senior royals, a balcony appearance that would close this chapter of their lives and open the door to whatever lay ahead. The palace balcony had been the stage for countless historic moments: coronations, jubilees, weddings, and victories. But as the sun began to set on this extraordinary day, it would witness something entirely unique. A farewell that would redefine how royal service could evolve while honoring its deepest traditions. Catherine stood before her dressing room mirror one last time as a senior royal, but her reflection showed no sadness, only calm determination. She had chosen to wear a flowing white dress designed by a young Asturian designer whose career she had championed through their arts initiative. The symbolic choice was deliberate: white for new beginnings, designed by someone whose success represented the kind of investment in people that had always motivated their work. Outside, the crowd had been gathering since dawn. The palace square, which could accommodate 50,000 people, was filled to capacity, with overflow crowds extending down the ceremonial boulevard and into the surrounding parks. People had traveled from every corner of the kingdom and beyond, bringing children who had grown up knowing no other royal couple in senior positions, carrying signs that expressed both gratitude and love. William joined her at the window overlooking the square, still wearing his ceremonial uniform from the cathedral service. The sight below took their breath away, not just the size of the crowd, but the obvious emotion rippling through it. People were holding candles again, creating a sea of flickering light that stretched as far as the eye could see. "Have you ever seen anything like this?" Catherine asked, her voice filled with wonder. "Never," William replied. "Not even for Father's coronation or our wedding. This is something completely different." King Frederick appeared in the doorway, his own formal robes replaced by a simple dark suit that somehow made him look more approachable, more like a father than a monarch. "The crowds extend for miles," he said quietly. "The police estimate over 200,000 people in the immediate area, with millions more watching around the world." The royal family gathered in the private sitting room adjacent to the balcony for a final moment together before the public appearance. Princess Elena looked nervous but determined, knowing that after tonight much of the attention that had focused on William and Catherine would shift to her. The children sat close to their parents, Alexander trying to maintain teenage composure while Charlotte and Louis made no attempt to hide their emotions. "Whatever happens out there tonight," King Frederick said, addressing the entire family, "remember that we face it together. William and Catherine are changing their role, not abandoning their family or their love for Astoria. At exactly 8 o'clock, the palace doors opened onto the balcony. The roar that erupted from the crowd was unlike anything any of them had ever experienced. Not the polite cheering of a state occasion, but something primal and emotional that spoke to a connection deeper than protocol or tradition. William and Catherine stepped forward together, their children flanking them, with King Frederick and Princess Helena completing the family group. For several minutes they simply stood there, allowing the crowd to express 15 years of accumulated affection and gratitude. When the crowd finally quieted enough for speech to be possible, William stepped forward. His words, broadcast live around the world, would be remembered as one of the most graceful farewells in royal history. "People of Astoria, friends around the world," he began, his voice carrying clearly across the square through the advanced sound system. "Tonight we stand before you not to say goodbye, but to say thank you. Thank you for 15 years of trust, of partnership, of shared dreams and shared service." He gestured toward Catherine, who moved to stand beside him. 15 years ago, you welcomed us as your representatives, but more than that, you welcomed us as partners in building a better future. Together, we've seen what's possible when people believe in each other and work toward common goals." Catherine stepped forward, her voice warm and clear as it carried across the hushed crowd. "We came to you as young people with hopes and dreams about making a difference. You taught us that real service isn't about grand gestures or ceremonial duties. It's about showing up, listening carefully, and never forgetting that behind every statistic is a human story that matters." The crowd responded with sustained applause, but there was something different about this moment. An intimacy despite the vast numbers, a sense that this was a conversation between friends rather than a formal address. "Tomorrow," William continued, "we begin a new chapter of service that will take us far from these beloved shores. But we carry with us everything you've taught us about compassion, resilience, and the power of ordinary people to create extraordinary change." In the crowd below, faces turned upward were illuminated by thousands of camera flashes and phone screens, but also by something deeper, a collective understanding that they were witnessing a moment that would define how leadership and service could evolve. In the modern age, Catherine's voice carried across the square as she spoke about their children. "Alexander, Charlotte, and Louis have grown up watching their fellow Astorians work tirelessly to build stronger communities, to care for those in need, and to never give up on the belief that tomorrow can be better than today. That's the legacy we're most proud of. Not the titles we've held, but the example of service that all of you have provided for our children." The royal children stepped forward, and for the first time in the evening, young Louis spoke into the microphone, his 12-year-old voice surprisingly steady. "Thank you for being such good friends to our family. We promise to remember everything you've taught us about being kind and helping other people." The crowd's response was immediate and overwhelming, not just applause, but calls of love and encouragement that seemed to come from every corner of the square. Handkerchiefs appeared throughout the crowd as people wiped away tears, and the sea of candles flickered like stars in the gathering darkness. King Frederick stepped forward for his own brief remarks, his voice carrying the authority of decades of leadership, but also the warmth of a father proud of his children. "Tonight, we witnessed something remarkable. A demonstration that true service knows no boundaries and that love for one's people can take many forms. William and Catherine go forward with our blessing and our pride." As the formal remarks concluded, something spontaneous and beautiful began to happen in the crowd. Someone began singing Amazing Grace, and the melody was picked up by voices throughout the square. Soon 200,000 people were singing together, their voices creating a harmony that seemed to rise like a prayer into the autumn. Catherine felt tears streaming down her face as she listened to the song that had sustained communities through centuries of joy and sorrow. Beside her, William squeezed her hand, both of them overwhelmed by the generosity of spirit they were witnessing. When the song ended, the crowd began a slow, rhythmic clapping that built gradually into thunderous applause that lasted for nearly 10 minutes. The royal family remained on the balcony throughout, waving and smiling, trying to make eye contact with as many people as possible in these final moments. Finally, as the applause began to fade, William and Catherine stepped forward one last time. Together they raised their joined hands in a gesture of unity and triumph, not victory over anything, but victory with everyone who had shared their journey. "We love you. Astoria," Catherine called out, her voice breaking with emotion, "and we will love you always." William added. As the royal family finally stepped back from the balcony and the palace lights dimmed, the crowd began to slowly disperse. But many remained reluctant to let this moment end. Small groups gathered around the candles, sharing stories and memories of their encounters with the departing royal couple. Inside the palace, the family gathered one more time in the private sitting room. The children were exhausted but exhilarated, full of questions about what they had just experienced and what it meant for their future. "Did you see Mrs. Chen from the Mental Health Foundation?" Charlotte asked excitedly. She was crying but smiling at the same time. "And that little girl who gave you flowers during the walkabout last month? She was right in the front row with her whole family." As the evening wound down and the children were finally persuaded to go to bed, Catherine and William found themselves alone on a smaller balcony overlooking the palace gardens. The crowds had largely dispersed, but the glow of the city lights reminded them that beyond these walls, millions of people were going to sleep thinking about the day they had all shared. "Was it everything you hoped it would be?" William asked, wrapping his arms around his wife as they looked out over the city they had served for so long. "It was more," Catherine replied. "It was proof that what we built together was real and lasting. Those people didn't come tonight to say goodbye to titles or positions. They came to celebrate relationships and shared values that will continue long after we're gone." In the distance, church bells began to toll midnight, marking the official end of their tenure as senior royals. But as Catherine and William stood together in the peaceful garden, surrounded by the city that had been their home and their mission for 15 years, they felt not the sadness of ending, but the excitement of beginning. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, and a completely different kind of service. But tonight had proven that they were ready for whatever came next, confident in the foundation they had built, and the love that would always connect them to the people and the place that had shaped them into the leaders they had become. The graceful goodbye was complete, but the story of service, theirs and their people's, would continue forever.